If you're looking to plan your next trip or holiday getaway, then this video is for you. Hi team, I'm Jess or Jashi Corinne on behalf of the Artronolive Ambassador team, and in this video we're going to be looking at 30 ideas to help you set up a travel journal. Some of these ideas are one-time layouts that you set up at the start of the journal, in the assumption that you're going to be using this travel journal for several trips. One such layout is something like a travel bucket list, so either writing down a list of the places that you want to go to, or possibly printing off a little world map and noting on there the places that you want to go. You could also use this one as a little bit of a tracker, so colouring them in after you've visited them. But as this is a travel bucket list, it's effectively a list of all of the places you want to visit at some point during your life, not necessarily for your next family vacation. Another start of journal layout that can be useful is something like a travel planning roadmap. So this just lists out the sequence of steps that you need to take when planning a trip. For instance, saving up, deciding on where and when you're going to be going, who's going to be coming with you, doing research, actually getting packed, and heading out. The actual sequence of steps might change depending on the type of trip you're taking, but having a list of those steps so that you don't miss anything important could be pretty useful. The next idea though is for a specific trip, so having a list of things that you want to do when you visit the place you're going to. The way I've set this one up is so that we have columns for each of the people who are on the trip and who actually wants to go to these locations, do these activities. We have a place to list out what the activities are, and then a place to check off whether they're actually going to be included in the trip. You could also have a space to indicate what day you're planning on doing them if you're having a multi-day trip in any one location. But our next idea is a budget and savings plan. We know that travel can be expensive and you might have to save up for these, so having a general idea of the costs associated with each part of your trip, how much you need to save for each of those things, can be useful to have so that you actually save the right amount. In this one, I have a list of the different items or areas you're spending on, the amount that you're budgeting for them, and the total. And then we have a little savings tracker down the bottom, so how much total will you need to have saved, how much have you saved already, and thus how much more do you need to save. You can also then consider how many weeks you have left to save, and based on the number of weeks left and the amount you still have to save, how much do you have to save per week? Once you figure that amount out, you can then figure out how you want to signify your savings in your little tracker. Very much depends on the amount you need to save, how many weeks you have, the space you've dedicated to your tracker, but having some kind of key that represents how much each of these dots represents, kind of useful. Flipping over though, our next idea is to have a space for your travel information. I have found these very helpful, especially when I'm taking overseas trips and I need to be wary of what my flights are in terms of their number, booking references, when they're leaving and arriving. But the information that you include on here is really up to you. It's just anything that's going to be helpful to have. Ones that I'm always very wary of are things like check-in times. I do not want to have missing my check-in be the reason that I didn't make it to my trip. Of course, this kind of information can be personal though, so make sure that you're not putting it in a space that maybe you're sharing on the internet. While the structure of this is based on an actual trip that I took, you can see I haven't included any reference numbers or anything like that because that can be personal or sensitive information. Our next idea though is a travel itinerary, so specifying what you're going to be doing on each day of your trip, whether that be very specific in terms of like times and locations, or just general ideas. Depending on the type of traveler you are, you might want to make this quite rigid, very specific so that you hit all of those points on any given day, or make it a little bit more generalist and just group them in terms of like, I want to hit these 3 places on one day of the trip, but not specify which day it will fall on. I'm the kind of person who prefers to have at least an idea of what's happening on each actual day, but I also recognize that not everybody works with a rigid structure, and sometimes people want an even more rigid structure. Our next idea though is having a space for your accommodation notes. So this is kind of similar to your travel information, but it's more so specifically about when you get there. This is where you can again have booking numbers, you can have contacts for the places you're staying, whether that be the hosts of an Airbnb or the hotel number to call. You may also want to include any notes that you need for the space. For instance, if they've told you a particular pickup location for a key, if there are any materials or resources you need to bring from home, for instance towels, linens, pillows. Again, depends on where you're staying, but making sure that you pack those things is kind of important, so having the information down in your journal could be useful. One of the things that I always find very helpful is a dedicated pre-trip checklist. This could be in just a couple of days in the lead up to your trip, or it could be things that you need to organize weeks or even months in advance. Having a dedicated space to hold all of those items though gives you that kind of one-stop shop to come and check in with regards to those pre-trip tasks, rather than just having them scattered in amongst the other things in your planners where they could get missed, which could then have a pretty big impact on your trip as a whole. I would also have this one separate to any kind of packing list because this is more things to do rather than things to put into a suitcase, but you could have some kind of combined or hybrid system if you wanted to. Our next layout idea though is a pre-trip learning space, or it could be a phrasebook layout depending on where you're going. These are just things that you want to learn or get accustomed with before you go on your trip. Especially if you're going somewhere that either they don't speak the same language as you, maybe they have different customs, things that you commonly do or your culture commonly does that they just do not do in that space. Mainly so that when you go on your holiday, you don't end up accidentally offending anybody. We don't want to do that. But this would just be a space to populate with checklists and notes of things that you want to know or learn before you go on your trip. Some examples are things like common terms or phrases that could be useful, any customs to be aware of, and really just any information you think will be helpful to know about the place that you're headed. Another thing that you might want to include in your travel journal is a pre-trip shopping list. Those things that you specifically want to buy for your trip, for instance, power converters, that's a big one, travel versions of supplies that you have at home that you might want like a smaller size of, essentially anything that you want to take with you that you don't already have. I find that I don't necessarily need this for every trip that I'm taking, but for some of those bigger overseas trips, it can be really useful. Down the bottom here though, our next idea is a trip meal plan, and this is especially useful if you need to make bookings for certain eateries before you go. If there are particular places that you really want to hit up and try their food, making sure you have a booking in advance can be very useful. So specifying where you want to go, possibly even roughly what you want to eat on each of the days, can be a nice to have, and it also can be a little bit of memory keeping too. I find that food ends up being one of the more memorable parts of most of my trips, so having a place to plan that out might be something you want to include. When it comes to packing for your trip though, something that can be very useful for that is having some kind of an outfit plan, especially if you're the kind of person who has a tendency to overpack, or if you're the kind of person who likes to coordinate their outfits. I'm also the kind of person who has 7 of the same black shirt and 5 of the same black pants, so it's not usually too much of a problem for me. But if your wardrobe is a little bit more varied, if you have particular items that go well together and you want to plan those out, making sure that you take each of the different pieces is pretty important. You don't have to do it in such a decorative way, you don't have to have a doodle or, in this case, a sticker to represent the outfit, but even just having a list of those items to make sure they end up in your suitcase could be handy. Another layout idea that can be useful when it comes to packing, and also just planning other aspects of your trip, is a trip weather forecast. Of course, weather forecasts aren't going to be so accurate depending on where you're headed. I know that, for instance, here in New Zealand, because of our general terrain, having accuracy in our forecasts doesn't happen as often as it could, but at least having a general idea of the climate to expect, general weather for that time of year, can help you not only plan when you're going to be doing certain things in terms of your itinerary, but also make sure that you pack appropriate footwear, clothing, all of that kind of thing. This one again could just be set up as a simple list. I just wanted to do it in a slightly decorative way. Flipping over though, our next idea is, of course, a packing list. It had to be included. So just writing out all of the things that you want to pack, and also probably a space to record how many of each item, especially if it's not the kind of thing that you only typically bring one of. So how many shirts do you need? How many pairs of socks? For this one in particular, I've made it a reusable list, so you can see in the light, we've got some tape sitting over the checkboxes for that one, and that just means that I can use this list multiple times over. You can of course just use a pencil and erase it after the fact, but the tape just means that as I pack things, I can just check them off my list or scribble out the box to say that it's done, and then once the trip is over, I can then just wipe those off and reuse the list for next time. This just means that I don't have to write out all of those items time and time again, and I can effectively just set up a master packing list rather than a trip specific one. One of the lists that I set up every single time I do a trip is a last minute list though, in particular a last minute packing list for those things that I can't necessarily pack the day before my trip, but I effectively have to pack it maybe half an hour before I walk out the door. This can also be a list of the things that you want to just check that you have before you leave, leave, things like your passport, any kind of tasks you might want to do in terms of like setting alarms, putting out bins. But this is essentially the last thing that I check before I leave the house, just to make sure that all of those items are either with me or tasks have been done. Another idea for your travel journal though is having a space for a destination deep dive. So this is effectively an opportunity to consume a bunch of media or information about the place you're going, kind of to get yourself excited about the trip, and also possibly to do some learning before you get there. I've set this one up using the Alistair method, so just a column for the different types of media, and then a space to write down what the item is. This is where you'd write down like the book title, TV show name, anything like that. And then as you consume those pieces of media, you can just cross them off underneath the relevant column. Another idea we have is having a map of your destination. This could also be a little bit fun if you went and annotated it with the different places you went and maybe stick in some pictures with memories. Notably, I'm using a traveler-sized notebook here, so I don't have super ample space, and it also depends on where you're going as to how big the map you're printing off, but this can be just another fun way to memorialize your trip in your journal. On to the next page, our next idea is travel journaling, which funnily enough, if you're setting up a travel journal, you might want to include. So this is just written notes of any happenings, thoughts, musings, memories. You can also kind of combine this with our next idea, which is turning your journal into kind of a photo album or scrapbook of your trip. As you stick in the pictures, make sure that you write down information that's going to be helpful to have after the fact. So for instance, the date and time that the pictures were taken, where were you, who were you with. You can write down memories for kind of context of those pictures, mainly so that future you has a bit of an easier time looking back on this and knowing what was happening. Something that some people like to do in their travel journals is travel art. So this is giving yourself that opportunity to be a little bit creative, do sketches, drawing, possibly even little paintings of the places that you're visiting, things that you're seeing inside your travel journal. This isn't my personal preference when it comes to capturing my memories, but I know that that can be a lot of fun for other people, so it could be right for you. Again, just make sure to take down some notes either beside or near those little pictures that you're doing, just so that you have some context looking back on it later. Another thing that could be fun to include is a things that I tried layout, so writing about the new experiences that you had and your thoughts on them. I've set this one up so that you could maybe have a little picture or icon that represents the thing that you tried, a space to list out what it was, give it a little star rating if you want to, and then just some general thoughts. I'd use this in particular for new foods that I tried, possibly even snapping a little picture of the food and sticking it into the journal, either while I'm away with a travel printer, that I don't have, so more likely when I get back and I have access to my computer. To make sure that future you knows what it was you wanted to stick in, you can just write down in pencil what picture goes in which place in your journal, and then stick them in when you get back if you want to. Or you could invest in a travel printer and use that instead. Similar to our meal plan idea, you might want to include a food diary in your travel journal. As said, food is usually one of the most memorable parts of a trip for me, so those are the kind of things that I like to include if I do any travel journaling. It can also very much help when it comes to getting back from your trip and trying to consolidate your expenses and see what you spent money on. So writing down what food was, where you consumed it, possibly the price, how much it was. That can be a little bit of fun to add as well. Another thing that you might want to add into your journal is just general memorabilia, especially flat ephemera. This could be things like pamphlets, it could be ticket stubs. Of course, as we talked about, adding pictures into your journal can be a lot of fun too. I do specify this as being flat ephemera because it'll just keep your journal a little bit nicer and easier to use, but as you stick things in over time, you will add a bit of chunk or thickness to your journal, which I know for some people can be very satisfying. Our next idea is souvenir planning. So who do you plan to buy souvenirs for and what are you going to get them? Just to make sure that if you're gonna get souvenirs for people, you get ones for all the people you're wanting to. We don't want to leave anybody out. Another one to use while you're away is things that I learnt while I was away, or things that I learnt in insert place here. I've set this one up so there's just a space to write down what it is you learnt and then maybe explain it a little bit further. So possibly it could be a phrase and what it means, it could be a custom and why it's important, anything like that. Flipping over though, our next idea is a daily highlight. So this is just writing down the top moment from each day, especially if you're not really into journaling, if that's not really your preferred way of taking down memories. Having just one or possibly two lines to write in what happened during the day can be a much more approachable way of keeping those memories. For any of the particular standouts in the trip though, you can summarize these in what's called a favorites or a highlights layout. This is effectively where you just set up a bunch of different categories for yourself before the trip, and then after the trip is completely done, you can think about in those categories, what was my favorite? So what was my favorite attraction or site? What was my favorite food that I tried? Anything like that. If you have a particularly large trip, you might want to make it a top 3, especially if you're having a hard time narrowing it down. But another thing that you might want to include, especially if you're using this trip as a way to meet people that you haven't seen before, or meet new people in general, is a nice to meet you space. This is a place to write down who it was you met, and some contact details for them if you want to keep in touch. I in particular set up a layout like this when I went to Go Wild, because that's very much about meeting new people, and just having that contact detail so that you can connect with them after the fact can be really helpful. Thinking more about things that you can set up for after your trip, having a space to reflect on the trip can be good, just kind of a space where you can decompress, think about your thoughts, feelings, what did you value from the trip, did the trip challenge you or change you in any way? I'm a big believer in the power of reflection, and I think that travel in general can be a really good opportunity to reflect on how that has impacted us as people. And then a different style of reflection, which is less about the trip and more about how planning the trip and executing the trip went. This is a notes for future me space. So anything that you want to keep in mind for next time you take a trip that's of a similar style. So if you went on an overseas trip, what's going to be useful for you next time you plan an overseas trip? If you went for a weekend getaway, what would be useful to know next time you do a weekend getaway? One of the lists though that is typically most helpful to have in your travel journal is a packing list. And while I've just set up a little one here, if you want one that's a bit more comprehensive, then be sure to check out the blog post that's linked in the description box. Otherwise, these 2 videos are the next one to check out. I hope your next trip goes super well and you have a great time. And as always, thank you for watching.